Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Mark Sheeland. I'm Director of Programs here at the Middle East Institute. We're very pleased that you all have joined us to examine a relationship that gets, I think, too little attention in Washington, that between Iran and Pakistan. MEI scholar Alex Vatanka wrote a path-breaking book that is now out in paperback and available for purchase here today. We had hoped to have Ambassador Teresita Schaffer, a veteran South Asia hand, join us for the conversation today. She appears to be detained, and we'll muddle through, I think, without her. But we have Marvin Weinbaum, also an MEI scholar, director of our Afghanistan and Pakistan studies, who will moderate today's event, lead the discussion with Alex about his book. Before we begin, I would ask you if you are seated on an aisle, if you could, and you see seats in the interior that are free, kindly move in, help us accommodate people who may arrive late. We are live streaming today's event, and we'll be recording for video and podcast purposes. So we'd ask you to please silence your handheld devices, but we do encourage tweeting, and please use the hashtag MEI event. I want to encourage you to keep up with MEI on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting our website regularly. You'll find terrific analytical articles, interactive graphics, and other tools for understanding the region. And you can also learn about upcoming events. For example, next Friday on June 23rd, Talia Sassan of the New Israel Fund will share her views on the ongoing settlement construction in the West Bank and on the state of democracy in Israel today. Please register to attend that event. Today, we turn our attention further east to the frontier of the Middle East with South Asia. Your moderator is Dr. Marvin Weinbaum, Director of Afghanistan and Pakistan Studies here at MEI. Marvin will more formally introduce Alex and lead the discussion after Alex's presentation until about 1:15. And Alex will stay on afterwards to sign books for those of you who pick up a copy. Thank you again for coming. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Well, is this working now? Yes, I think it is, yes. Well, welcome again. This is a program which we've been planning for some time, and now that we have a paperback, a very reasonably priced paperback, it's the appropriate time we go ahead. For a topic, Alex, well, let me introduce Alex first. Alex is as most of you know, is a senior scholar here, fellow at the Middle East Institute, and specializes in regional security affairs. Comes out of a background where he was with Janes for a number of years, important role there. But I'm not going to spend much time on biography here because you have that in your program that you're carrying, that you've brought in with you. Alex, when you first told me about wanting to write this book, Teresita Schaffer, please. Ambassador Schaffer has joined us. The ambassador is known to most of certainly the South Asia community here in Washington. Having been, we know her mainly for her service in the Foreign Service, where she served I first met Teresita in Islamabad in 1976. She went on to postings Israel as well as Bangladesh, yes, and Sri Lanka, where she was ambassador, headed the Foreign Service Academy here in Washington, and so on. Again, I think the full story on a remarkable career is available on the sheet that you brought in with you. So, as I was saying, Howard, thank you for joining us. Howard Schaffer. When you first broached it, I remember my first reaction was, I don't know if you remember this, I said, here's a book that needs to be written. Nobody has really seriously looked at this relationship, and it's a great idea. It's a great idea. Now, after several years have passed, I see it as, I was so prescient in this because what was a good idea now has become, I think, examination of a rather critical relationship in the region. One which we really could not have at the time, I think, have really appreciated how this is going to develop and how this bilateral relationship in the context of the Gulf and South and West Asia generally, how important a role this was going to play. But why don't I let you, Alex, say a word about what motivated you to write this book?
Great. Thank you, Marvin. First, let me thank everyone for coming here on a very hot June day. It's a pleasure to have you all in the room, and thank you very much, Dr. Schaffer, for being here with us today. So I very much look forward to the conversation, and before I answer Marvin's question, let me just say, Marvin's been there from day one, so he's been holding my hand throughout, and it's a real pleasure to sit here on this panel and be quizzed by Marvin Weinbaum. So that's something I look forward to. But Marvin, why did I do it? So 2012, this is roughly when I put together an idea of a book on Iran-Pakistan. Most of my friends are saying, why Pakistan? Why don't you, take another subject matter that's more timely, that's more relevant, that has perhaps more relevance for the news media and so forth. I picked Pakistan because by then, 2012, I had been working on Iranian foreign policy for about 15 years. Now, if you look at Iran's 15 immediate neighbors, there are two big giants in Iran's neighborhood. One is Pakistan, the other one is Turkey. There is plenty of material on Iranian-Turkish relations, but there's almost nothing on Iranian-Pakistani relations. In fact, there's more material on Iran's relations with smaller neighboring countries like Armenia, for example, Azerbaijan, than this giant to Iran's east. That's nuclear armed, almost 200 million in terms of population, has been engaged in proxy war with Iran in Afghanistan and elsewhere. You got a long list of items, to my mind, that make that relationship interesting to follow. So I was puzzled why nobody had done it. Now, I found out later on that writing a book on the subject is not that easy because the relations are so security-centric. What do I mean by security-centric? Basically, it means unless you are one of the boys who knows how to knock on the right doors, oftentimes you don't find material or people who are willing to talk to you. I got some of that, but in the process of writing a book, I still found plenty of material that I thought really put together. I hope you would find it, those of you who pick up a copy, puts together the relations in a big historical context, how it all began, where it moved, and why it's where it is today. But it's been a pleasure to follow this relationship between the two countries, and I'm only hopeful that people who look at the book, will agree with me in the sense of appreciating how underexplored relations are between the two countries. And that, I think, is a grievance one can put at the door of the Iranian and Pakistani governments. Why haven't they given more attention to this important relationship? Because I think if they do, there'll be some good things coming out of it.
Yeah, so you've just hinted at this. What were some of the challenges that you faced in writing a book of this kind? Because we know that you're not persona grata in Iran
Right.
these days. So please.
No, I mean, look, as you said, I couldn't go to Iran, but I'm a Farsi speaker. So what I could do was tap into Iranian sources. This included trips to places like Montreux, Switzerland, where I would end up talking to people like Ardeshir Zahedi, who was the last Iranian ambassador to Washington, and he had happened to be very close to the Pakistanis in the 60s and 70s, and sitting down and talking to him and learning firsthand from somebody who was there when relations were relatively good, again, enriched me personally, I have to say. But I mean, back to your point about challenges. It took me good 3 months to be able to get a visa to go to Pakistan. And you remember that, Marvin. The Pakistanis wanted to know, why are you coming to Pakistan for? What's the reason? What do you want to write this book for? But once I got to convince them that this was actually meant in all good spirit, they let me in. But another thing that I didn't have, access to archives. When I asked Pakistanis in Islamabad, I would love to be able to get my hands on your archives, the way I've had access to archives in London and elsewhere, they will say, what archives? You probably will find out more about our relationship in archives in Washington and London, which is hard to believe, and I still don't believe it to this day, but that's what they would say to me. Marvin.
Yes, yes. As you came into the subject more deeply,
Right.
What struck you as some of the misconceptions that we have had about the relationship between Iran and Pakistan?
For me, when I went in and started researching this topic, oftentimes you hear 1979 is the turning point. That when the revolution happens in Iran, you have a turning of the page. Everything changes. And my research, certainly when I was talking to Iranians who were involved, showed that the Shah of Iran, as early as 1971, had decided that, look, I cannot be involved in choosing Pakistan against India in this proxy conflict that Pakistan and India had. And therefore, I'm going to try and be neutral. Now, that decision by the Shah to become neutral is what upsets the Pakistanis. And what the Pakistanis do in turn, which is actually a process that started earlier, is to compensate for the loss of the Shah, they turn to the Gulf Arab states for finances, diplomatic support, and so forth. Again, given the Shah's poor relationship with the Arab states, that fact in itself worsens relations with Iran and Pakistan. But the point is, this happens as early as the early 1970s. So the idea that everything changes in 1979 turned out to be inaccurate.
What misconceptions did you see the Iranians have about Pakistan and Pakistan about Iran? How well did they understand one another?
I mean, one of the things you often hear from Pakistan is we have culture, history, and proximity that it keeps us together. And those things are true. But the one thing that they also have, which is true and they don't talk about, is this inherent rivalry. And I think, if you want to turn to the 1940s and 50s and say that's the golden era of Iranian-Pakistani relations, that happened to be the period where both sides felt that they were pretty much on the same level. By the time the Shah's oil money starts pouring in it, and he can afford to buy the types of guns and diplomacy that money can bring with it, he feels that he's the bigger brother in this relationship, and that the Pakistanis really resent. And actually, again, I want to go back to something that happens in the 1970s. This is about nationalism. It had nothing to do with things that oftentimes are spoken about today, sectarianism. The man who basically, in many ways, Marvin, turns around and says, look, Iran, I'm not going to let you be the big brother in this relationship, is a Shia, the Shah of Iran. The other person on the other side in Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto, is also a Shia. So sectarianism was not a factor. I think what really starts turning the two countries away from each other is their different geopolitical readings about what ought to be done for their national interests respectively in the long term. And Iran's choosing to be neutral in the Pakistani-Indian conflict really upsets the Pakistanis.
Well, was Shiism really entirely not a factor? After all, there is tension within Pakistan here between the Shia and Sunni communities. There have been killings and so on. But even going back into the 1970s,
right,
you had a situation where there was evidence here of Iran's interference it struck me, for example, that even though there have been killings, generally by a group called Lashkar Jangvi, of Shia professionals, Hazara group, which is predominantly Shia, even though there has been this, in this period, Iran has never once, to my knowledge, never once said, wait a second, those are our co-religionists. We don't like the way they're being treated, what they're undergoing. There seems to be an understanding, isn't there, between the two countries not to let things get between them as much as they possibly can.
No, that's a great point. I mean, how would I put it? In 98, you had Iranian diplomats killed in Mazar-e-Sharif. You literally have about 9 or so Iranians machine gunned in this compound in Mazar-e-Sharif. Now, the Iranians know right away, at least that's what they think, that ISI of Pakistan had ordered the killings. Okay? There's a guy who flees, comes back to Iran, says the Pakistanis ordered the Taliban to carry out this attack. At the time, this happens right pretty much at the same time as Pakistan has gone nuclear, which is one of the factors to bear in mind. Now, Pakistan by now is a nuclear armed state. The Iranians decide not to make a big deal out of it. And I want to compare that to, for instance, this latest ISIS attack that just happened in Tehran last week. Within hours, you had Iranian hardliners certainly come out and talk about how Saudi Arabia and allegedly, as they would say, the United States were behind the attacks. How do you square that? How do you, on the one hand, I know I'm going back some time when I go back to 98, but I will say overall, even if there's an attack today, even if, say, one of those attackers that was engaged in this attack last week in Tehran fled over into Pakistan, the Iranians have shown to be more or less reserved in their reaction to the Pakistanis for what Iran has at times arguably said, you're tolerating militants that are hitting Iran on your soil. Why don't you do anything about it? But that's not a new charge. The Iranians have been making that charge against the Pakistanis for a very long time, and yet there is an understanding on both sides that it's best to have sort of managed rivalry the way they have, as opposed to all-out conflict, which sometimes seems to be what you have when you look at Iranian-Saudi competition. I think the way I've sort of squared that in my mind, why that happens is Pakistan from day one, pretty much since independence, has had to prioritize India to its east, second to that Afghanistan, and does not want to have a hot war or hot front vis-a-vis the Iranians on that western border. The Iranians are busy in their competition for power with their regional rivals in the Arab world. Again, from their perspective, they also rather leave that border alone. So I think that in many ways explains the complexity, because we certainly see that Iran and Pakistan are engaging, if you look at Baluchistan area, in this tit-for-tat proxy conflict. And yet neither side wants to go all the way out and accuse the other of harboring enemies of theirs, if that makes sense.
So both sides have kept a certain degree of restraint here in an effort not to turn that into a hostile border, because obviously
Right.
they do have. I want to bring Ambassador Schaffer into this as well. Tazy, please.
Well, I had the advantage of reading this book about a year ago. I was sent a review copy by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And my first light bulb moment was, my goodness, is this really the only book that's been written on this subject? I come at it from the opposite direction from Alex. I served in Pakistan, as Marvin has already told you. That was my second post in the Foreign Service. I have visited Iran during the Shah's glorious day, but I have never served there. So I looked at this on the basis of some knowledge of Pakistan's perspective and much less on Iran's perspective. I came out of my 3 years in Pakistan with a couple of very strong impressions, none of which were challenged really by your book, and some of them were reinforced. Not long after we arrived, planning was underway for a visit by then Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto to Tehran. And Alex has talked about national interests. Let us not forget the two larger-than-life personalities that were involved. And there was a story, which may well be apocryphal, but it was just too delicious not to keep making the rounds, that one officer, presumably a fairly senior one from the Iranian embassy, had come in to see the chief of protocol, who was a retired general with something of a smart alecky bent. And after the chief of protocol made what the diplomat considered to be a somewhat disrespectful reference to His Imperial Majesty, the two of them got into a fist fight. So it was an interesting interpretation of protocol. But what was underneath this was the interest that both of them had in maintaining strong regional relations, and including in that Turkey, the RCD group, which was supposed to be an offshoot of CENTO. CENTO was kind of moribund from the time it was born. RCD did a little better, but not a whole lot. But they both had an interest in their relations with Washington, and they both had one eye on Washington as they dealt with each other. But there was a kind of mutual contempt in play, which got played out through these very dramatic personalities, in which, putting it undiplomatically, I would say that the Iranians looked on the Pakistanis as hicks, peasants, rubes, and the Pakistanis looked on, or particularly military officers, looked on the Iranians as wimps. I assume that both sides were aware of this and didn't like it. It was rarely articulated with both sides, but you did get echoes of parts of it. The fascinating thing that I got out of the book's description of this period of Iran-Pakistan relations, here we're talking about the 1970s, was the fact that initially, Pakistan kind of looked on itself as the big brother. And Bhutto was not into looking on himself as a little brother to anyone. So he certainly would have shared that. But they were just at the point, accepting Alex's chronology, where the Shah was starting to look on himself as the big brother. And I think they were well into the stage where the United States considered Iran the more important of the two. Pakistan's importance to the United States had a lot to do with the facilities they allowed U.S. intelligence to use in the Peshawar area for overflights of the Soviet Union and other kinds of intelligence sharing. That had ended by this time. That was gone by the early 1970s. And at this point, Pakistan was considered a relatively stable country. It had been considered relatively economically successful. Those of you who've worked on Pakistan more recently will probably have your eyes rolling, but this was the perception at that point. It wasn't considered a country in crisis. And the Shah was looking immortal. And so that immortality was useful to Bhutto, who was, at this point, considered something of a thorn in Washington's side. Not a terrible one, but one that was frequently inconvenient because Pakistan was really not quite a big enough stage for this man, who saw himself as a world figure and acted accordingly. The sectarian part of the relationship is kind of hard to get your arms around. Pakistan does have a Shia population of about between 15 and 20% of the total, including some very prominent families, prominent in business and politics. And in a couple of parts of the country, you have a significant Shia population of actual peasants who work the land. What they're often referred to as the Aga Khanis, the Ismailis in the northern territories, are Shia and have been remarkably successful in developing literacy and small business and so on, and also in attracting homegrown development organizations. You did not, in those days in the 1970s, have the kind of sectarian conflict that you have now. But people were certainly conscious of the fact that there were Sunnis and there were Shias. And that became even more a part of people's consciousness as the oil price went up and the Shah's oil money was coming in, but so were the oil revenues of the Gulf Arabs and especially of Saudi Arabia. King Faisal, who was assassinated during this period, was looked on with great affection, I think, in Pakistan. And there were more Sunnis than there were Shias. So Pakistan always had, and still has, an allergy to getting involved in Sunni-Shia squabbles. You see that today when the recently retired Chief of Army Staff decided he would sign up to be the commander of this essentially all Sunni military coordination body. It was quite controversial in Pakistan. He was eventually allowed to take the job, but it doesn't look like he's going to hang on to it for very long. And when the attacks happened, the ISIS attacks happened in Tehran, they were, of course, condemned in Pakistan. Any attacks on Muslims are going to be condemned. But the whole idea of having to take sides, as, for example, in the Yemen conflict, makes Pakistani politicians, military officers, and other national leaders extremely uncomfortable. Because in some sense, it threatens the rather tenuous Islamic concept that holds the country together. Not that Islam is a tenuous concept at all, and certainly not politically in Pakistan, but defining what it is has always been complicated in Pakistan. Those who have periodically introduced legislation to make Shia the secular law of the land have quickly foundered on the rock of which school of Islamic jurisprudence they are introducing, and they have never been willing to make that decision. So you have Pakistan's great unifying factor, which also turns out to be a source of division.
Daisy, I wonder if we can just open, you've opened up that aperture here for the more regional. Did you?
Can I have one other point that I wanted to make. I was struck by Alex's comment that 1979 was not a total turning point in Pakistan-Iran relations. It was, however, a turning point in another sense, in the sense that with the Shah gone and Iran having a revolutionary government, the way the outside world looked at Iran definitely changed. And while Pakistan continued to want to maintain decent relations with Iran, there was an uneasiness about the whole process and an increase in Sunni-Shia violence in Pakistan. It's a complicating factor.
Alex, clearly now we have to see this relationship in its larger context. Developments, particularly in the last few years, but they were there even earlier. I remember in the 70s, the Shah very much wanted to be the policeman of the area. So this idea that Iran was going to play a larger role, and you've written about this, I think, very, very great detail. And I might mention that the book is extraordinarily well written. Alex is, Alex is a scholar in almost every respect, except for maybe for a PhD, but otherwise fully a scholar. But Alex brings to this book here his skills as a journalist here, and it's a very readable book. Alex, where do these two countries now fit in the larger scheme here, in this very obvious tension here between Iran and Saudi Arabia? How does this relation sort out?
Great. Marvin, before I answer that question, just two quick points, if I may, in response. Dr. Schaffer, when I was doing the research for the book, I don't know how many cables I had to go through. The words Sunni and Shia did not come up, maybe with the exception of once. Certainly on the Iranian side, I mean, it was just not a factor. You had to go back to the 1950s when there was a talk at one point about a confederation of sorts between Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan to bring these three countries together. And remember, all this is driven by an American kind of a design, if the US could pull it off, to make this part of West Asia inaccessible for the Soviets that were sitting not far to the north. So everything that's happening here in terms of these grand designs, you have to consider that with the United States' calculations in mind. So when there was this talk of a confederation briefly, although it sort of as a subject matter stays on all the way up to the 70s, but it was most seriously taken as a subject matter in the 50s. There are Pashtun tribesmen in Afghanistan who say basically, hell no, we're not going to have a Shia king, because the Shah of Iran had sort of imagined himself as the head of this confederation. Other than that, you really don't have the Shia-Sunni issue as a factor. And remember, you've always had, as you just heard, a nice-sized, large Shia minority in Pakistan. But the Shah never really wants to exploit that the way the mullahs that come to power in 1979 starts doing.
It was always rumored that Bhutto himself was of Shia origin.
I thought it was a fact.
Yes,
but I mean, if you tell me it's a rumor,
it's something he never paraded,
right?
But that in fact his mother certainly was Iranian and Shia. So that
his wife,
I'm
talking about Zulfadi, or
and
his mother was Kurdish.
Yes, and his mother. Yeah.
1979. I think you really make it a very important point. Which is, if you're sitting in Pakistan, never mind the culture, the history, the geography, and everything else that brought you together, if you're Iran and Pakistan. Consider this also as one of the reasons that the Pakistanis kept looking at the Shah as a useful ally. Throughout that period, before Shah is toppled in 1979, he's not only a source of subsidized oil and loans, but he's also importantly a source of taking talking points and having a goodwill of sorts for Pakistan, take it to Washington and say to presidents such as Johnson and Nixon and so on, look, you can't give up on Pakistan. You can't let the Indians do all these things to Pakistan. Nobody else at the time is talking on behalf of Pakistan the way the Shah does in those days at such a level in the White House, because the Shah had this close relationship with 8 successive American presidents. He performs a role that in the eyes of the Pakistanis really can be replaced. Nobody else could do it. At this moment, at that time, I should say, there is no Saudi lobby or United Arab Emirates lobby or so forth in Washington that could perhaps speak for the Pakistanis. That job is one that the Shah has, and the Shah does it more or less believing it was a good cause. Now, 1979 happens. That man who was speaking positively on your behalf is gone. And the folks who have taken over in his place are anti-American to their core. So suddenly one of the most useful aspects of having an ally in Iran, in the eyes of the Pakistanis, is gone. The money that used to come in is gone because within a very short space of time, when the Shah is toppled, Iran is engaged in an 8-year bloody war with the Iraqis. Every single dollar the Iranians have, they need at home. So, in other words, this isolated Iran that you describe is very much one that's not attractive for the Pakistanis. Why on earth should they want to team up with the clerical establishment that takes over in Iran? To what end? Pakistan, after all, never subscribed to the ideology of the Islamic Republic of Iran of changing the global order or spreading the revolution. Pakistanis, from what I understand, and good folks in the room who know Pakistan more than I, correct me if I'm wrong, much more about defending Pakistan's national interest. Certainly in the 1980s, they had no time. They had no time for the sort of revolutionary language that was coming out of Tehran. But to Marvin's point, that revolutionary language has changed. Today, a good part of the Islamic Republic doesn't believe in the revolutionary language and spreading the revolution the way they used to believe in the 80s. And I think that might create some opportunities in Iranian-Pakistani relations, depending on where Iran goes from here onwards. If Iran becomes a normal economy, if this market of 80 million people that's rich in so many ways becomes a market that the Pakistanis can perhaps tap into, benefit from, cooperate with, and so forth, well, that will change, I'm sure, the equation for Pakistan in terms of how it looks at Iran. But if you look at the duration of the period since 1979, if you're sitting in Pakistan, you have a country next door that you can't ignore, but really wasn't bringing much to the table anymore. It couldn't do anything for you diplomatically. It couldn't do anything for you in terms of money and so forth. And therefore, it was kept at arm's length. That, however, doesn't mean Pakistan wants to fall in the trap of having to take one side in ongoing competition for power that we have in the region that some people are hoping or suspect Pakistan might do. For instance, you mentioned the Saudis, Marvin. The Pakistanis have gone out of their way to say, we're not going to be party to this Iranian-Saudi competition for power. And it's been true from day one. When the Saudis asked Pakistan, look, come and help us out in Yemen, the Pakistanis were very polite about it, but the fact is they haven't sent anybody to do the fighting on behalf of the Saudis against in the conflict in Yemen. In other words, I think what Pakistan has done, and you can see this if you track the relations all the way back to the early 80s, what the Pakistanis have done is to sort of sit on the fence to the extent that's possible, not pick sides. They can see the Iranians provide much in terms of tangible benefits, but they don't want to pick up a fight with them either. And I think that's where they are today. That's exactly where they are today. I mean, we talked about it earlier, I think, this Islamic military alliance that Saudi Arabia has created with a Pakistani general, a former Pakistani general, Raheel Sharif. You know, the Pakistanis have been very careful about what this means to their relations with the Iranians, making sure the Iranians don't read this to mean Pakistan has now joined the Sunni bloc against Iran. Again, the Pakistanis are not interested in that. I think that in that sense, nothing has changed. In that sense, they're still focused, preoccupied with their interests vis-a-vis
Well, has
India.
something changed here?
Right.
Okay, so Pakistan has balanced this relationship. Obviously, it has ties to Saudi Arabia, which are not only economic, they're spiritual. In real politics terms, it's got to be cautious of its relationship with Iran. But this balance here, would you agree, they were able to manage this balance, and I think it took a foreign service on the part of Pakistan here, a great deal of skill to do this. They were able to do this because neither Saudi Arabia nor Iran called them on it. Neither of them said, you've got to side with us against them. That is, they made it easier for Pakistan by not having to choose. What has perhaps happened now, and I'd like your thoughts on this, is that we're seeing Saudi Arabia particularly, and with the Yemen request very much in mind, now saying, in effect, now it's time where you're going to have to come down on one side or the other. And this puts Pakistan in a very dangerous position. Obviously, it's with Iran that it shares a border, however many obligations it may have to Saudi Arabia. And just one thought also in this, the appointment of General Sharif to head this alliance. Is it your understanding here that although it was read originally here as anti-Iran, that he's on a tight leash in which it's understood that you can play this role, but be careful that you don't do anything which has clearly Iran marked as a target?
Right. I mean, on that second point, Marvin, I can just say I've been surprised by how little reaction has come out of Tehran to this Islamic military alliance. And that lack of reaction usually means one or two things. They're really worried about it. They don't want to talk about it much. Or they're not actually worried about it. They don't think this is going to go anywhere. They've looked at pan-Islamic, pan-Arab organizations come about in the past. They haven't usually produced much. Why would this one be any different? Which I believe is an alliance of 41 countries. So they see it perhaps as some Saudi initiative to sort of create the image of, you know, there is a new whole front in the Islamic world against Iran. But as I said, I don't think the Iranians so far have taken it very seriously. And that obviously creates space for the Pakistani General Sharif, former Sharif, to sort of not get himself criticized or attacked by the Iranians.
Could I make a comment on that?
Sure.
It's important to remember Iran and Pakistan are big countries with a lot of people. Pakistan, a little bit more than twice as many as Iran. They're both big. Saudi Arabia has a small population. Saudi Arabia, moreover, has a long history of looking to Pakistan for basically military staffing. They've had Air Force experts there for generations. And the Pakistan Army has been also called on to do ground duty. So that in reaching out to Pakistan, and indeed to General Sharif, the Saudis were doing what they'd been doing all along. It's just that the new circumstances made the Iranians more uncomfortable about it.
Now, can I just add, we tend to think of it in terms of Pakistan needing Saudi Arabia. But I guess you could argue in a way Saudi Arabia needs Pakistan. After all, there are 200 million potential, or perhaps fewer than that, potential converts to their brand of Islam. Here's a what a wonderful opportunity here to expand the kind of Islamic views that Saudi Arabia has. A small population, and here you can build, and they pay for mosques and for madrasas and so on.
If you've ever taken a plane between one of the Gulf airports and Pakistan, it's all in the visual. You have all of these young guys who are just finishing up their stint as remittance labor. And typically in their luggage and carry-on, they will have an air conditioner, a fan, a bunch of rather large kitchen equipment, and heaven only knows what's in the belly of the plane. And enough money saved up so that the fortunes of their family are really transformed. So that this is another dimension of Pakistan's relationship with the other side of the Gulf. They never had the kind of remittance opportunities in Iran.
No.
So that the Iranians were less worked into Pakistani society in that sense.
I mean, frankly, I think, one of the problems we have here or one of the factors we need to keep in mind when we're talking about why does Iran or the authorities in Tehran not give enough attention to this country to their east, Pakistan. I think maybe that's part of the problem is the fact where Tehran is located. I mean, if you're sitting in Tehran, Pakistan, to get to Pakistan, you have to cross the big desert in central Iran. You have to get to Iranian Baluchistan, when in itself, if you're asking Tehranis, is a different country altogether. And by then you have, historically in the minds of Iranians, you've reached India. So that there is a problem here with the Iranians, certainly the elite in Tehran, have kind of kept that part of the world, their eastern neighbors, out of their calculations. And I think in the long term to their own detriment, because they have tended to look at the East as where there's trouble. Where there's drugs coming in, refugees coming in, or instability. What does that do? That makes the entire relationship being sort of contextualized in terms of security calculations. It's all about security. I mean, I mentioned Turkey before, and I want people to think here about what I'm about to say. You have two large neighbors of Iran, Turkey and Pakistan, okay? And in many ways, Iran faces the same kind of issues from these two countries, right? Turkey is large, so is Pakistan. Turkey's got a large army, so does Pakistan. Okay, Pakistan is even nuclear armed, Turkey isn't, but still pretty formidable. Turkey is an ally of the United States. Pakistan claims to be, or tries to show its credentials. There are rivals in terms of power for the competition in the region and so forth. So why is it that Iran has so much better economic and arguably political relations with Turkey than it does with Pakistan? What is the one factor that kicks in and makes Pakistan so different from Turkey, when Turkey and Pakistan in so many other ways pose the same kind of challenges to the Iranians? And I think some of it to do with what I said, the Tehran factor. There is this kind of over there east that's just not worth our time. It's security. What do? We send Revolutionary Guards, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, down there to take care of the border, and that's all we do. It's seen as a security problem, and it's not just Pakistan, but even southeast of Iran is seen as a security issue for them. And I think that what it requires before Iran can really come up with healthier policies vis-a-vis Pakistan is just to start thinking about the East differently. I mean, just look at some of the demographics that are available in terms of what's going to happen in Afghanistan, Pakistan in years to come. I mean, the population growth alone, as has been projected, should get any Iranian policymaker in Tehran to think about, all right, we can't just keep ignoring it. We just can't think about what kind of a wall or fence are we going to put in here. We need to have more holistic approach to our eastern neighbor. And I say that because, again, Iran and Pakistan, I think Marvin mentioned it, combined have a population of 300 million people. This is a fair-sized market, right? Iran and Pakistan trade with one another for about 500 million. 500 million US dollars. Iran trades more with tiny Armenia than it does with Pakistan. Armenia, a country of 2 million people. And at this point, Marvin hit me when I arrived in Islamabad airport on my first trip, and stood there in the line trying to go through immigration, and the lights were off. Suddenly we were standing there in the darkness in Benazir Bhutto International Airport. And as I'm standing there thinking to myself, here is Pakistan, energy starved. And next door you got Iran with the largest gas reserves in the world, desperate to try and find markets for its gas. And actually, for the last 20 years, they've tried to come up with an idea for a pipeline. All sorts of agreements have been signed. All sorts of names have been given to this project. And yet, there is no Iranian gas as of today going into Pakistan. I mean, how do we explain that? How do we explain this kind of disconnect? Lack of political will, a large dose of suspicion of one another. But also, I think maybe there's a cultural issue here, or among the political elite, where they just don't seem to give that issue of Iran-Pakistan relations enough attention. And maybe you can't argue with that. Maybe you can say, well, how much attention can Iranian policymakers give to every issue in the region? They tend to prefer Saudi Arabia to be focused on than Pakistan.
This point here about looking west or south rather than looking east, it's interesting because could that now change beyond the reasons that you've given if there were a radical Sunni regime interested in expanding its influence to come to power in Afghanistan? Were the Taliban to succeed, or a regime like the Taliban, Would Iran now, with Iran's attention, be forced to look in the eastern direction? Because initially it did have this reaction when the Taliban came in 1974, 94 and 96. You know, if we can, let's now bring everybody else into this. We have about 25 minutes or so, so please, the floor is open for questions. And keep them brief. Limit it to one question if you would, and identify yourself. Please.
Hi, my name is Carmela. I'm with
Yeah, wait for the microphone. Since we're broadcasting this, we're taping it.
Hi, my name is Carmela. I'm with the National Iranian American Council. I'm interning there for the summer. And my question is that there has been speculation that Iran is supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan, and that Pakistan has historically been supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan. And so I'm wondering how this affects the stability in Afghanistan, as well as Iran and Pakistan's relationship.
Should I take it?
Please.
You know, for a very long time, the Iranian state would deny having any ties with Taliban. But I think from about 2014 onwards, there's been a bit of a U-turn in policy, whereas Iranian diplomats, you know, openly will say in their interviews and in the commentaries that, look, yeah, we do have a relationship. I mean, does that mean we have a Taliban office in Mashhad that's up and running the way it is in Doha? Question mark there, but yes, we do have a relationship with at least part of the Taliban movement, and they tell you the following reasons for why they do that. One, and this is an important part for American policymakers considering what to do on the question of Iran's role in Afghanistan. There is this Iranian reading that America will eventually get bored, tied, and leave Afghanistan, which means they're back to where they were in 94, 95. They're going to fight it off against the Pakistanis. Another proxy war is going to happen, because U.S. will go. If that's your reading, that seems to be at least a good part of the Iranian system believes that to be the case. Then you have to talk to anybody who might prevail in the on the Afghan scene. And Taliban, certainly with about 40% of the countries under its control, is not to be dismissed. And above all, what the Iranians want is to make sure they have the right type of Taliban commanders on their side that happen to be the most powerful in Afghanistan's west, which Iran considers to be its sphere of influence. In the city of Herat and so on, for the Iranians, if they fall into the wrong hands, that becomes that much more of a security issue. So there is an understanding, it seems to me, I couldn't scientifically prove it, but there's an understanding of sorts where the Pakistanis have their sphere of influence down south where the Pashtuns live, and on the Iranian border, western Afghanistan, Herat and so on, is what Iran's security interest are and sphere of influence is. That happens to be also where Iranian economic trade and investments are biggest, most visible. I mean, Iran is not investing, in Jalalabad. I mean, if you want to see Iranian investments, you got to go to a place like Herat and Kabul. Pakistan is a big part of this. As I said, there is a situation where you go back to the 1990s, and it's Pakistan and Iran backed by their respective allies. And in some ways, what you see right now is that same scenario being recreated. The Russians are moving towards the Iranians on the issue of Taliban the way they were in the 1990s. The Saudis and the Pakistanis, some Gulf Arabs might go back the way they were together. So what happens in terms of long-term U.S. policy is going to be very important to shape
And
those calculations.
even now, the Indians are debating whether they should open up lines to the Taliban.
Right.
All hedging strategies.
Right.
Let's.
And
Yeah.
I think there's another dimension to this. There was a time when the United States and Iran were actually talking to each other about Afghanistan, and had identified a lot of interests in common. What that conversation didn't address, but what I'm sure was in the background and in the background of what you just described, is Iran's interest in making life difficult for the United States, probably with a view towards making sure that the United States in fact left. I mean, they expect it, but they might want to give an extra push on the way.
Yes. Okay, this gentleman over here.
My name is Dan Silverstein. I'm a private sector advisor, and I want to read you
To whom?
a sentence that I wrote for myself. The Central Asian countries have evolving economies with constructive relations with Turkey and Europe and the U.S. Wouldn't it be to Pakistan's advantage to forego banging their head against the Iranian wall and shift their economic interests to the Central Asian countries?
The Pakistanis have just joined the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, as have the Indians. I suspect the main motivation is that neither one of them wanted the other guys to be in without themselves being there to keep an eye on them. The Pakistanis have long felt that they had a big stake in Central Asia, which hasn't really been matched by how much they knew and how much influence they had there. And that goes back to when Central Asia, well, what that means is that when Central Asia broke away from the Soviet Union, Pakistan's expectation was that the Central Asian countries would become their best friends, which in point of fact didn't happen. I mean, the relationship was cordial enough, but there just wasn't all that much substance there. I think the bigger problem, though, is that basically for Pakistan, there is one important issue in their foreign policy, and that is India. And everything else is important insofar as it relates to their, what they feel is an existential threat from India. And the Central Asian countries don't come close to competing with that concern. In many ways, it's a great shame, I think, if the Pakistanis tended their relationships with some other parts of the Muslim world. They could have made that feed their economy and put themselves in a very different position in the world. But so far, at least, that hasn't happened.
Can I comment?
Yes, yes.
I mean, the two facts I think that are important to bear in mind when it comes to the calculations of the Central Asian states. One is just sheer geography. If you're Kazakhstan, if you are Uzbekistan, landlocked or doubly landlocked, and you want to get to the international markets, you got a situation where you got China, you got Russia, and you're looking for that third outlet. A country, a person like President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan has been very open for a long time that Iran should be that third outlet. Right down, and he's putting his money where his mouth is. I mean, in the last couple of years we've seen a whole new rail network set up that takes cargo from Kazakhstan through Turkmenistan to Iran and meets Iranian ports on the Persian Gulf. Now imagine if you had to do that in Afghanistan. For that to happen, you need a lot more stability, I should say, in Afghanistan before that becomes viable. The big litmus test on that one is probably the gas pipeline for Turkmenistan that could take Turkmen gas through Afghanistan to Pakistan and potentially onwards to India. Again, been on the table for a long time. I don't know which companies out there are willing to underwrite a project like that. The other thing to bear in mind, this is my experience traveling and talking to Central Asians. They happen to fear Iranian influence less than potential Pakistani influence. And that's kind of a bit of a puzzle in many ways, but it seems to boil down to this. Iran as a Shia majority country can really export any shenanigans, Islamism, to these Sunni majority, largely secular former Soviet republics. Whereas Pakistan's Sunni version seems to be a bit more of an internationalist Sunni version. I mean, I know they're worried about groups like the name Hizb ut-Tahrir and groups of that nature, which don't have really a presence in Iran, but do have a presence in Pakistan. So the Central Asians are very, very much careful in terms of monitoring which of their citizens go to Pakistan to study, to stay, because what ideas are they going to bring back? But overall, I will say it seems to me that Tehran right now has been able to sell itself better to the Central Asian states than Pakistan has, which, as I said, is a surprise because Iran's anti-Americanism is always dragging it down. Pakistan doesn't have that, and yet the Pakistanis are struggling.
The interconnectivity between Central and South Asia, which we all agree would be in everybody's interest, transfer of resources, trade, it's difficult to conceive of it when there's no interconnectivity, when there's no connectivity within those regions. Those countries don't allow easy trade among themselves or put obstacles of various kinds. So before you can have that, you're going to have within the regions the kind of relationships among the states which are amenable to that kind of development. Please, right here.
Maybe I can just use my
Well, yeah.
Hi, my name's Mark Boyd. I'm not really affiliated with anyone, and I'd like to ask the ambassador, first of all, thank you all for coming today and giving us your insight. We've heard a lot from the Trump administration, in particular against Iran and against the deal and all that, but I'm interested to find out from the ambassador if you were asked to provide your recommendations on what to do with Iran and what to do with Pakistan, what would be your recommendations for U.S. policy?
Well,
Thank you.
just to be clear, nobody's asked me, and there is not the remotest chance that they will do so.
Not now.
I think as far as Iran is concerned, I would say stick with the deal, implement it as best you can. If you've got a bunch of talking points that you have to eat, do so quietly. As far as Pakistan is concerned, there have actually been contacts between Pakistan and the Trump administration starting during the transition period. I think Pakistan is looked on as a country that is in trouble, which is fair, but one whose trouble could backwash onto other countries, including the United States, which is certainly also fair. And without wanting to hijack the meeting for an excessively long discussion of the ins and outs of Pakistan policy, I would say that it cries out for more realistic expectations on both sides. Pakistan has a long history of dealing with the United States on the assumption that the United States needs Pakistan more than the other way around. That has led to a kind of excessive expectations on both sides, which we would be well rid of. But handle with care. It is a nuclear power. It has a large army. If it were to fulfill some of the direst projections of the doomsayers, and they've managed to avoid that so far. It has remarkable resilience in spite of all of the things that seem to be trouble potential. But if some of the doom scenarios came about, that really would be a big export of trouble. And so, handle with care.
Okay, back over there.
Nader Gohari. I'm president of Global Risk Intelligence. I was just wondering whether during your research in this book you've come across anything on Jundallah and if there are any Pakistani influence that is going to be in Iran through this organization.
Thank you. No, there's plenty on Jundallah. I mean, the Iranian reading of Jundallah is that without at least elements in Pakistan facilitating for what it does inside Iran, used to do, obviously the organization doesn't exist anymore as such, then it wouldn't have been able to carry out those attacks. Which again takes me to a fundamental point that I think is in the way of why relations can't improve or aren't improving fast enough, which is this suspicion. There is this deep suspicion about what the other side is doing. So in Iran, I never forget talking to various people at an event at one of the institutes in Islamabad, and there were a group of foreign diplomats, including Iranian diplomats, and they will say, yeah, well, the Pakistanis aren't telling you everything about what some elements in Pakistan are doing to help some of these Baluch militants, Iranian Baluch militants that are hitting Revolutionary Guards and others in the border regions, and which has been going on for a very long time. Again, back to this point of suspicion. one thing I say before I stop there, answering that specific question is, if I was sitting in Tehran, I would worry about a long-term threat of ethnic militancy inside Iran's borders, including Baluchistan, moving from being what has historically been nationalist and leftist, driven by ethnic grievances, to something that looks like, international Sunni jihadism. Iran has about 8 million Sunni minority. It cannot afford to have more of this stuff happening on its soil. These 5 attackers last week all came from Sunni backgrounds in Iran's Kurdish regions. This is pretty new, but in fact, Sunni jihadis have been operating in Iranian southeast for a very long time. At times, Iranian armed forces have, without notifying the Pakistanis first, crossed the border in pursuit of some of these militants, to just show you the potential for this getting out of hand. If you are sitting in Tehran, you want to think also about your broader policies in the region that are feeding into this sectarianism that's going on. And it's a fire that's finally coming, has been at Iran's doorsteps for a long time, but might actually enter in a way that we haven't seen before. And that's going to be a problem for the Iranians. So next time the Revolutionary Guards are thinking about taking Pakistani Shias or Afghan Shias in Fatimiyun or Zainabiyun brigades and take them to Syria to have them fight on behalf of Mr. Assad, think about the long-term implications for Iran's own Sunni-Shia relations at home. Because what Iran is doing right now in Syria is definitely fueling sectarianism. And it's a sectarianism, as I said, could become much more of a headache for Iran itself than it has been in the past.
Gentleman here.
Hi. Okay, cool. Hi, my name is David Dupriest. I'm with the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs. My question was, to what extent have external factors or external actors either played a role in dissolving or stabilizing the Iran-Pakistan relationship, not just like the United States, but also countries like China, Russia, or even like Israel?
I think the short answer is not much. Pakistan puts great value on its relationship with China. Iran, as far as I'm aware, it's thinner, but the Chinese tend, I think, to stay away from getting too deeply involved in aspects of their friends' business that don't directly concern them. With respect to Russia, there has, for many years, not been much there in the Russian-Pakistan relationship. There's a little bit more now, but that's been a very thin relationship, and I think the same is true in revolutionary Iran. We've already talked about the United States. I don't think it's been much influenced by outsiders, because I don't think most of the outsiders have that much interest in that relationship as such.
Except for Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, no, I was about to say, I mean, the Gulf Arabs certainly would like to see Iran and Pakistan not have close relations. To be diplomatic about it. But I mean, look, you really haven't had much of a reason for anybody to get involved. As I said earlier in my remarks, the Iranians and the Pakistanis, despite huge amounts of tension at times, have made sure it doesn't get out of hand, right? And I think that basically neutralizes for the need of others to come in and have to play the role of the mediator. If anything, it's Pakistan that's offering its mediation services, for instance, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. China, I should say, was brought up. Interesting case. Here's China, which right now, I don't know what the Chinese end game is in South or West Asia, but you have China right now potentially investing billions of dollars in 2 ports, one in Pakistan and maybe soon to come one in Chabahar, which has over the last few years mostly been funded by the Indians, but the Indians might not be committed to this port in the long term. The Chinese have said we can come in and fill the gap if the Indians don't want to do it, which basically means China will be sitting there in 2 ports, one in Gwadar in Pakistan and in Chabahar in Iran, spending billions of dollars on 2 ports that are supposed to do the same thing, basically become conduits to Central Asia. I don't know if that's going to happen, if one port has to, if China owns both, if one of those ports would have to give to the other. But my point is, because China was brought up, the Chinese are much more interested in sort of infrastructure, economic development, and making themselves into the economic kingmakers in that part of the world. And so far, it seems to me, they have been able to avoid any kind of political traps. And maybe, you know, that's an asset.
It could be, though, that it's China's own ambitions here in terms of the role that it wants to play generally become stronger, become realized, that it will find pressures to intervene in ways that it has not in the past.
Right.
Up until this point, it had only marginal reasons for doing so. I think we have time for one more question. Seeing none, we'll let Alex finish with his remarks, concluding remarks, please.
No, again, just thank you, Marvin. Thank you all for coming. It's great to have you all here and have some of your questions. It was a pleasure to, and Dr. Schaffer, of course, thank you very much for your presence on the panel and your book review, which I thought was very fair. It's a relationship that's going to be very interesting to follow. I think anybody who says Iran-Pakistan relations is not going to be any more exciting in years to come than it has been in the past, I think might be mistaken. Look, you have a whole host of issues that make this relationship potentially very interesting to come. We have 2 large countries, 1 nuclear armed, 1 nuclear threshold country. We got sectarianism, we got the future of Afghanistan, we got potential economic cooperation, not to mention all the geopolitics that's happening around them with the Saudis and others, each trying to move one country against the other. So I think it's going to be an interesting relationship to follow in months and years to come. And anybody who cares about it, I'm here. So if I can help in any way, please knock on my door. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, and let's show appreciation.
Thanks, Marvin.